So everyone, we're going to start right now. Dr. Burke Harris and Dr. Pond, are you ready? The public line has been connected, and we will put down the PowerPoint so everyone can see each other. Thank you.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I will just do a quick kickoff. Just want to, again, thank all of you for your valuable time and input. Really appreciate this committee and all of the great perspectives that you provide for us. I wanted to just give a little bit of an update. I think you heard a little bit of it from Dr. Sarjenko from Mariposa County. We actually did report today a record high number of cases. Over 53,000 cases were reported today. This is, to give you perspective, at the peak in July when we were worried then, I think our peak was around 13,000. So this is over 3 times what our peak was. We're definitely continue to be concerned about our intensive care unit capacity, and most importantly, not really the beds themselves, but actually the staffing and the people. And so the other big announcement for today is that the Association of Bay Area Health Officials, that region, the Bay Area, has also gone under the 15% threshold of intensive care unit capacity. So they hit 12.9% as of today. So they will also, with the state criteria, go under the stay-at-home order starting tomorrow at midnight at 11:59 p.m. Many of those counties and the city of Berkeley had already sort of self-ordered very similar restrictions, but it just again reinforces statewide. I'll say also our latest number for intensive care unit capacity is only 4.1% of our intensive care unit beds. So we do just want to continue to ask all of you to continue to be our messengers. And as Dr. Sarjenko was saying, it's a really mixed moment time because we are at the worst surge that we've seen in California and are very concerned about our ability to manage this with our healthcare systems. We're doing a lot on the state side to mobilize additional staffing, asking for some federal resources, but again, those are stretched thin given what's happening in the rest of the country. We're looking for some international resources. We're standing up some alternate care sites, especially to help decompress and offload from some of our residential cares for the elderly and skilled nursing facilities as well, and really working on creative ways to help staff statewide, but lots of concerns from our end, and really excited that the first vaccines have arrived. And we're getting all of your input and others on how we will prioritize this resource that will be scarce in the beginning, but lots of great news about efficacy and vaccines on the horizon. So as many of us have been saying, and many other leaders have been saying, we do have a light at the end of the tunnel. It's still a long tunnel, but very nice to have a light. So it is getting all of us through it, but we just need to hunker down together for the next few weeks to try to blunt this incredible surge we're seeing and really try to protect our healthcare system so that all of us can get the care we need and get the standard of care we're used to in California moving forward. So again, thanks for your input on helping us with all the important work to make sure we're doing vaccines and distributing them in a safe and equitable and transparent way. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Burke Harris.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pan, and thank you for your incredible hard work. I want to welcome everyone to yet another meeting of the Community Vaccine Advisory Committee. And I want to thank everyone for your amazing participation. We have had incredible attendance at these meetings, as well as really robust participation, which has made this process really what we hope for it to be, which is really this participatory community process. And today's meeting is going to focus on an update from 2 members of our Western State Scientific Review Work Group, and beginning a discussion on community engagement and vaccine acceptability. One of the things that we've heard from you all is that you all have incredible recommendations for us about things that we should be considering as we're thinking about community engagement and some of our messages, particularly to our vulnerable community. And so we want to hold a space in today's meeting to really pull out more of that input because it's incredibly valuable to us. We're also going to, following that, we will have a full discussion of the phase 1B essential workers. So we know that that is something that folks are are eager to discuss, and we look forward to holding a good amount of time for that discussion. And we look forward to receiving everyone's feedback throughout this meeting, both verbally as time allows and also via the chat. And I really want to thank everyone for their excellent use of the chat so that we can collect all of your questions, comments, information, and really inform this process. So we've appreciated all that feedback that we've received. And I'd like to introduce our fearless moderator, Bobby Wunsch, who can review the meeting process and also summarize the public comment that was received after the last meeting. Bobby, you are on mute.
I'm so sorry, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Burke-Harris. Well, I've also been so impressed with the commitment of everyone in this group, both through attendance, but also your incredible comments during the meetings and in between the meetings. Just a reminder for everyone that our meetings will be as interactive as we possibly can make them. If you could all keep your cameras on, we'll do our best to mimic an in-person meeting as if we were all sitting together somewhere in Sacramento. Someday we will be back together again. Keep your phone lines on mute until you're ready to speak. And for the members of the advisory committee, if you will use the hand raise icon on your Zoom screen when you're ready to speak, then we can call on you. And as you've noticed through the first 3 meetings that we've had, I like to try to make sure we can hear from as many different people as possible as we go through the discussion part of the meeting. Just a reminder to all of the members that the chairs have requested no delegates or substitutes. So if you have staff that you want to listen to the meeting, they can go to our YouTube live stream, or they can listen on the English and Spanish telephone lines. We're very pleased to have our ASL interpreters, Katie Sales and Vicki Kennedy, interpreting for us today. And we also have closed captioning for the members. You can see here the website where you can find all kinds of information about our meeting, all the materials from this meeting and previous meetings. I think as everyone knows, the public is in a listen-only mode. We have an English line and a Spanish line, and we are live streaming through YouTube so that the public can watch the meetings. Anyone wishing to make public comment, that will be done in writing only through the email COVID-19 vaccine outreach at cdph.ca.gov. The public comments are accumulated over the course of the week. They are sent out the day before the meeting to all of the members of the committee and posted on the website. And in a moment, I will summarize the public comment that we received before this meeting. If any of the members of the committee have any technical issues with Zoom, if you'll write into the chat your technical question, our IT expert, Aaron Matlin, will be happy to see if he can help you with any of these issues. So with that, I'd like to go on and summarize the public comment that we received. I know you've all read it. If we can go on to the next slide, please. We had a public comment of 106 pages of public comments. These are actual comments made by members of the public and sent in to the email address that I read a few minutes ago. The comments that you are sent are not summarized. They are verbatim of the comments that are sent in. And they are going to be posted the day of the meeting for the public to see as well. Those 106 pages of comments were 142 individual comments, and they were in 5 categories, which I'd like to review for you. One member of the public asked to be included as a member of the Community Advisory Committee. 131 of the 142 comments related to being part of the Tier 1 of Phase 1B of the essential workers. In other words, hoping to be close to the front of the line to get the first vaccines after the healthcare workers. And that included a variety of organizations. The Chief Justice of California Supreme Court asked that court employees and judicial officers be upfront. The public defenders asked that they be considered to be upfront in the line along with their incarcerated clients. People living in independent, non-licensed senior living apartments and properties, the PACE program participants and staff, day programs for the elderly, the cemetery industry workers, dentists, podiatrists, ENTs, and other physician specialists, farm workers and agriculture workers, the poultry industry, NASA workers who live in California, public transportation workers, private transportation drivers, transportation service workers for people with disabilities, teachers and school personnel, individuals with underlying health conditions and their providers, security services, beverage and food manufacturers, behavioral health providers and their clients, both public and private, national security staff who work in California, waterfront workers, healthcare testing and device distributors, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, their caregivers and the staff working with them, Latinos, the frail elderly, Amazon workers, solid waste management workers, delivery workers, blood and plasma center workers and clients, contract cleaning companies, the California Retail Association and the Association of Chain Drugstores and Pharmacists, providers of services to people with autism, power grid workers, and airport workers. A third area where we had 5 comments were issues about safety of the vaccine and the ability for certain individuals to make informed consent, particularly those living in long-term care facilities. The fourth area, there were 2 questions about how to obtain vaccines and how to offer vaccines to the commenters' clients. And the 5th area were 3 seniors, each of whom gave their age, all over the age of 78, who wrote passionate statements about the importance to them individually of essential workers getting the vaccine before them. So that summarizes the 142 comments that we received from the public between December 7th, when we cut off the public comment before our last meeting, and December 14th. Thank you, Dr. Burke-Harris and Dr. Pond.
Great. Thank you so much, Bobby, for summarizing those. I think it is, again, really helpful to get all of the public comment and also very helpful for you and your staff to summarize that for us. So thank you again. A couple of things I just want to add overall. Just it's such an honor and privilege to work with this group and then our drafting guidelines work group, who you'll get to meet later as well, the chairs of that. And then it's my pleasure to introduce to you all today 2 of our leads, or 2 of our members in our Western State Scientific Safety Review work group. So Dr. Art Reingold, who's our chair, unfortunately could not join us today, but we are very lucky to have Dr. Mark Sawyer from UC San Diego School of Medicine and Rady Children's Hospital. He's a current member of the FDA, we call it VRBAC, or the Vaccine and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee. And they offer their recommendations to the FDA on the emergency use authorization for the various new vaccines, including recently the Pfizer vaccine. And then they'll be reviewing tomorrow the Moderna vaccine. And then also Dr. Grace Lee from Stanford Children's Hospital as well, and Stanford School of Medicine. And she's a member of the CDC Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. So they're going to take a few minutes today to update you on the overall EUA approval process and the safety of these new vaccines and their recommendations as a Western State Scientific Safety Review work group. And then after their comments, we'll have time for a few questions. And I just wanted to let you all know briefly just that I will have to step off between 4 to 5, but then I'll be back for the discussion about the allocation prioritization. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Sawyer and Dr. Lee.
Great, thanks so much. I think Dr. Sawyer and I have talked a little bit offline and just chatted that perhaps we could start out with just a brief overview of the processes that VRBPAC an ACIP uses to make recommendations. And then we'd like to spend most of the time on the thinking about the recommendations from the California Scientific Safety Committee, and to be able to discuss and answer any questions that you might have about vaccine safety in general. So Mark, would it be okay if I turned it over to you for a moment?
Sure, that's great. Thanks, Grace. I'll start with a review of the FDA process. I was a member of this committee in somewhere from around 2014 to 2018. So I've been through many reviews and then was called back to rejoin the committee as part of the COVID vaccine review. And what I can tell you about the process is that the company puts together a package of information from the clinical trial. It's submitted to FDA. The FDA staff spend several weeks reviewing all the data and reanalyzing it to make sure the conclusions are sound. That is presented to the advisory committee, which is made up of experts from around the country who are not associated with government organizations. They're experts in infectious disease and public health and statistics. And we are given the opportunity to review the data, ask questions of both the FDA and the manufacturer. We entertain public comment as part of the meeting. We have an extensive discussion among ourselves, and then we make a recommendation to the FDA. And based on my prior experience, I can assure you that the process with the Pfizer vaccine last Thursday felt identical to the process I had been through in the past with other vaccines. So I'm very comfortable that nothing is being cut short or short-circuited as part of the FDA process. And I think I'll stop there and let Grace take it back.
Thanks so much. And the other committee, so after FDA, after VRBPAC makes a recommendation to the FDA commissioner, and after FDA authorizes or approves use of a vaccine, ACIP is asked to weigh in on recommendations for use of the vaccine in the US civilian population and provide our recommendations to the director of the CDC. Similar to the committee that Dr. Sawyer described, we are also an independent committee, federal advisory committee made up of independent experts ranging from vaccine trials all the way to public health. And we also have a consumer representative as one of our ACIP members. We have met, I'm also part of the ACIP COVID-19 vaccines work group. We've met over 27 times since March. We have had 9 public open meetings with the full ACIP, and the full ACIP is the body that makes the recommendation since June. I think we might have actually had more than 9. I've lost count actually at this point, all focused on COVID-19. And we actually also have a process that we have had in place for a long period of time in terms of how we review the evidence, and also what we call the evidence to recommendations framework that we use for all of our vaccines, that considers the epidemiology and public health burden, the benefits, risks, and the benefit-risk balance, values of the population being vaccinated, acceptability to key stakeholders, resource use, and feasibility and implementation issues. I will say that the only difference perhaps, and it's a really good difference this time around with regard to that particular framework, is that for COVID-19 vaccines, we have not only focused in on the science, but we've recognized the critical importance of having an ethical framework for allocation, and health equity has been central to that ethical framework for decision-making, in addition to implementation issues that come with unique characteristics of each vaccine candidate that's being approved. And we, I believe it was within a day, maybe less than 24 hours after FDA approved, met, but recognize that we have actually been deliberating about COVID-19 vaccines on at least a monthly basis. And at this point, it's weekly, and this weekend it'll be daily around each of the vaccine candidates. The overall sort of picture, as well as each of the vaccine candidates, will get its own separate review and vote. And agree that we have followed all the same processes. Again, the difference being that we have really had a laser focus on health equity. And in addition, we have really needed to compress the timeline appropriately so to be responsive to the pandemic. We want to make sure that we have recommendations out as soon as possible so that the vaccine can be used by the population, and found again that the benefits of this vaccine at 95% with the Pfizer vaccine and the risks associated with vaccination, that benefit risk balance for us really in the context of the pandemic made sense, and the committee unanimously voted on recommending the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine last weekend. We anticipate reviewing the data and discussing the Moderna vaccine this weekend. In terms of the California Scientific Safety Committee, we focus, and I believe you have the report, which has been shared widely, but we focused in on making sure that the processes were evaluated, that we actually also had really robust discussions around key issues around safety and equity as key components of our discussion, and have formulated and also independently reviewed all of the data that came through both phase 1, phase 2, as well as phase 3 trial data for Pfizer vaccine. And we anticipate again this week reviewing the Moderna data that's coming through now. I can hit some key points around general safety findings, if that would be helpful, Bobby, or what would you like us to do?
Yeah, why don't you hit a few points, and then when you and Mark are ready, we can take some questions from the members, because I know a lot of people have some safety concerns they'd like to ask about.
Sure. So first I wanted to just highlight that the Pfizer vaccine trial and the Moderna vaccine trial have focused on enrolling diverse populations. A colleague of mine at Stanford, and hopefully the video got shared, actually,
Yes.
a great way of framing it, which is that I know folks are nervous about vaccine, but we are not the first. Nearly 40,000 trial participants go through in each of those trials. And really, those are the people that have been the first to get the vaccine. There were 3,500 Black or African Americans included in the Pfizer clinical trial, 1,600 Asians, and 10,000 Hispanic or Latinx individuals who agreed to enroll in the trial. The efficacy was 95% overall, and it was actually similar across age groups, which we were very excited by gender and by race, ethnicity, as well as by comorbidities. Recognizing that the trial was powered specifically for the overall population, but that it's important for us to make sure that for the subgroups that the efficacy does look quite similar, and we are reassured that it does. Side effects that are common are things like local and systemic reactions. So local reactions being things like a sore arm or pain and tenderness and redness at the site of injection, and then fever, fatigue, headache, and myalgias or muscle aches are common systemic symptoms after vaccination. They are short-lived. They tend to occur shortly after vaccination and only last a couple of days, and are more frequent after dose 2 than dose 1, and are less frequent in older individuals versus younger adults. And I think that all of that put together, we wanted to make sure, number one, that people are aware and not fearful that if they're experiencing these symptoms that something's wrong. These are common reactions after a vaccine, but also that it could be considered a positive sign, which is that it really is a reflection of your body's immune response to the vaccine. And given that it's more common after dose 2 than dose 1, and more common in younger adults versus older adults, where we know that sometimes older adults have less, are sometimes less responsive to these vaccines, although in the efficacy trials it looks quite similar, that in general, we're thrilled that that this probably reflects more that the vaccines are producing a very strong immune response in individuals. Just comment really briefly about anaphylaxis. It's an infrequent event, but it does occur after vaccination. It can occur in anyone who's receiving a vaccine or medication, and we anticipate 1 to 3 cases for every million vaccine doses given in general. And it can happen as, anaphylaxis happens as frequently as 1 in 5,000 times in the case of commonly prescribed antibiotics such as penicillin. So it's one of those things that can occur after any vaccine or medication or biologic. And we are looking to the CDC as well as colleagues from our allergy and immunology community to discuss and provide a continued counsel around the diagnosis and management of these reactions. The final thing I'll just say is that vaccine safety does not end with approval or authorization. After every new vaccine approval, we are typically prospectively monitoring the safety of vaccines as they are used in the population. There are many federal safety surveillance systems that have been longstanding and are going to be monitoring COVID vaccine use and any potential adverse events as soon as this week. There are longstanding systems and newer systems. Some of the newer systems include vSafe, which you may have heard of, which we can talk a little bit about. And we are really strongly endorsing that all healthcare providers report into VAERS, which is co-managed by CDC and FDA, again, any vaccine adverse events. We anticipate that we are going to get more reports in than we've ever gotten about vaccines, and we're trying to really enhance education for providers, healthcare communities, and patients to make sure that everyone is contributing to vaccine safety. And the more information we have, the quicker we'll learn, and we'll learn together. And ACIP is committed to reviewing the data as it comes in, and if anything would change the decision or the benefit risk balance, would reconsider that information and reconsider any decisions over time as this pandemic evolves. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Grace. And Mark, anything else you wanted to add before we open it up for questions?
Well, I'll just punctuate Grace's nice summary of this by pointing out that between the FDA committee, the ACIP committee, and the California Safety Committee, we have 40 to 50 independent experts from around the country who all have reached the same conclusion. There have been no substantial concerns raised about either the effectiveness or the safety of this vaccine. So I think people can be reassured that the process has been thorough.
Great. Thank you both so much. And now we're going to take questions from the members. So please use the hand raise icon. For those of you who might have forgotten since last week when we had our last meeting, if you go to your participant list, you'll see the hand that you can raise. And we're going to start with Mike Dark, and then we'll go to Deborah Shade, and then we'll go to Aaron Carruthers, then David Lound, and then my friend Andy Imparato.
Thanks for that, Bobby. Just a quick question. My understanding is that at the ACIP level, some concerns had been raised about the relative scarcity of data, vaccine data about residents in congregate facilities, long-term care facilities. Can someone flesh that out, especially with an eye to how that might affect messaging to people who are living in long-term care facilities?
Sure, I'll take that. And Mark can chime in. I will warn that I'm a pediatrician, or that's my yes, we had a robust discussion about the fact that the clinical trials have been done in adults who are typically not living in long-term care facilities. And there was a robust discussion about the importance of having, efficacy and safety data in that medically fragile population. I will also state that, the question was if we waited for data on the long-term care facility for those trials to happen in long-term care facilities, we might be waiting for months to a year. And so then the question really became, we understand that the data around the benefit risk balance may be less certain in that medically fragile population, but we were also faced with the thought that even though they're representing at least about a month ago, 6% of the US cases, but 40% of the cases of death due to COVID-19, that given what we had seen, the totality of the data around the safety and efficacy of the vaccine, the feeling was that the benefit risk balance, given those high mortality rates, warranted use and ongoing safety monitoring in that population. The other choice would be to, wait until that data became available. But like I said, it could have been a year before that data became available. So we always make decisions under uncertainty, and given the evidence in that moment, the recommendation was to move forward. In terms of thinking about the safety, I think one of the important issues that Dr. Talbot raised during that meeting is that that is a medically fragile population, and that population at baseline probably has a higher mortality rate than those same aged individuals who are not living in long-term care facilities. So one of the important things to remember about vaccine safety is that we are going to have to better articulate and understand what the background rates of both disease and mortality are in populations, particularly medically fragile populations. And make sure that we are able to understand if there are any adverse events that follow vaccination. Is it different than what would be expected at baseline in the absence of vaccination? In clinical trials, it's fairly easy to do that because you randomize folks. When you're rolling vaccination campaigns out, people are going to have events that occur in life just because they were going to occur anyway, and the vaccination is just coincidence. But it's being able to disentangle what is actually a safety event attributable to vaccine versus what happened to that individual and would have happened regardless of vaccination. Does that answer your question? And Mark, maybe if you can chime in with anything else.
No, this issue was also discussed at FDA, and we basically reached the same conclusion that the overall benefit of the vaccine outweighed the risk, even in that population, which was not thoroughly studied.
Thank you. And I forgot to remind all the people asking questions if you could say your name and organization. So that was Michael Dark from the California Advocates for Nursing Home Reform. Thanks, Mike. So let's go on to Deborah Shea. Deborah, introduce yourself.
My name is Deborah Shade. I represent the California School Board Association. I have three sort of detailed questions. Number one, it seemed like the discussion for the group was centered around pediatricians not sure about the data for the 16 and 17-year-olds, and it's unlikely that they're going to get the first rounds as they come out, but certainly I think that population was focused on because they would be going to college in the fall, and could they build immunity to be able to participate in that? So I wanted you to address that, and because I know that there were some that voted against because of that. The other one is, do you feel comfortable with the data, the ethnic, the numbers and the representation in the demographic and ethnicity data? And is there a way to translate that into some messaging for the vaccine hesitancy that we're already seeing among even healthcare workers that are in the, in the first round? And then finally, and also included in that, I don't think that they looked at those with allergies, those with pre-existing conditions, and maybe you could just touch on that really quickly. And then finally, the vaccine, the two-dose vaccines, I'm hearing that the immunity out of the first dose is in the high 50, 60, and then the second dose reaches that 95%. Can you address that, in terms of another piece of that, if you participate in the two-dose vaccine, what are you getting out of that first dose that has to hold you for 21 days, and what kind of, mitigation measures in terms of masking we should provide during that period between first and second dose? Thank you.
I'll start with that because the 16, 17-year-old discussion started at FDA when we reviewed the age groups for which were included in the clinical trials. And it is correct that that particular age group had a smaller representation than other age groups. But in the end, the discussion centered around the plausibility that a 16 or 17-year-old is that different from an 18 or 19-year-old. And again, the overall benefit seemed to outweigh the theoretical concern of risk. We certainly have not seen any other vaccine with an unusual or disproportionate reaction rate in middle adolescence from later adolescence. As to your question about the diversity built into the trials and the data on ethnic and racial minorities and other subgroups, this, as Grace mentioned, this has been emphasized from the beginning of the development of these vaccines. For, in my experience, the first time ever, we have really done a reasonable, not perfect, but reasonable job of including a very diverse population in the big clinical trial. And it's based on that attempt and the data that came out of that organization of the trials that we've concluded that there is no signal to suggest there's any discrepancy in safety or effectiveness in any subgroup population. As Grace mentioned, we'll continue to monitor that as the vaccine starts to roll out. And then last year, with regard to one dose versus two, keep in mind the study was, both studies of the first two vaccines were designed to only look at what happens after two doses. We do have a little preliminary data about what happened after the first dose, you're right that the estimates of effectiveness are somewhere in the 50 to 70% range, but those are not highly accurate since the study wasn't designed really to look at that. Even after 2 doses, much less after 1, people still need to mask and follow social distancing because we don't know yet whether these vaccines reduce the possibility of you getting exposed to the virus, having it in your nose or throat. Although you may be protected and not get sick, there's the possibility you could transmit it. And we will learn about that in the coming months. But for now, we don't know the answer to that. So for that reason alone, we need to continue to mask and socially distance.
Thank you. Thank you, Deborah, for those questions. We're going to move along because I want to make sure we can get the people who have their hands raised questions answered. So Aaron, let's go to you. Please introduce yourself, and maybe you could all try to limit yourselves to one question instead of every question that you have about this issue, which all of us have many.
Bobby, I'm glad to do a one question with 3 parts. Hi, Doctors Lee and Sawyer. Aaron Carruthers from the California State Council on Developmental Disabilities. Thank you for your leadership nationally in representing California so well, and thank you for coming today. Could you speak a little bit more? Our community has a lot of concerns about the safety and the impact and what's known and what's not known about the vaccine. We've been talking to our community, polling them, holding listening sessions. 62% said, I'm concerned about the safety of this. Can you tell us about what's known about the comorbidities? Who was actually involved in the clinical trials and the comorbidities involved? How can that then be extrapolated to say it's going to be safe for people with disabilities? And do we know anything about drug interactions?
Well, so yeah, the Pfizer data has been published in the New England Journal, and Mark, you can correct me, but essentially a large proportion of the individuals with comorbidities included things like obesity, respiratory and cardiac disease, diabetes. I would say that more information is always needed. In terms of thinking about the benefits and risks, I think that the main question that I had going into those trials was, is the efficacy going to be as high as in a healthy adult? And I think what I was reassured by is that the efficacy is quite high, even in individuals with comorbidities. Now, there's additional populations that are being studied. So immunosuppression is one of them, where we worry that the immune response may not be as robust. But we also have to balance that against the fact that a lot of these individuals with these comorbidities are also at high risk for both hospitalization and death. And so I think those are the things that we're trying to balance in terms of making sure that the benefits of the vaccine, when thinking about the risks of the disease and the risks of the vaccine itself and how that all balance out. I'm going to bump it back over to Mark for a second, and because I've already now lost the second question.
I think that's what the extensive post-marketing or post-release databases are for, is to allow us to really understand in very unique populations whether there's any unusual side effect or effectiveness change. So far, nothing has been seen, but admittedly, the numbers are small, particularly for people with developmental disabilities. So the overall preponderance of the evidence suggests they should do just as well, but we'll need to continue to study that.
So that's helpful to know that there's people with IDD included in subsequent studies, and people in my community can know that to decide whether or not they want to wait until those results are known. Is that accurate?
I'm sorry, did you say inflammatory bowel disease?
No, IDD, intellectual and developmental disabilities.
Actually, so I just saw a study that came through that talked about the really high risk of complications in adults with IDD. And so I think, again, I wouldn't anticipate that the safety considerations would be substantially different, to be honest. So of course, there was going to be more information and we're going to learn as more of the population is vaccinated. But what is clear is that they are suffering higher rates of severe disease in general. And so I think it's really about an individual discussion around what are the benefits and risks, and also just thinking about what the risk is in the environment around them. And are they able to receive all the services that they need without interacting with individuals? I think that's been the hardest thing, is that I think that the disparities that have been brought about by this pandemic have been huge, and really limited services to a huge proportion of the population that actually needs services and can't actually receive them at the same level that they were able to prior to the pandemic. So, again, that's my.
Yeah, I just want to clarify, I wasn't referring to ongoing clinical trials, but as the vaccine gets used, the databases that Grace referred to that can track patients after they receive vaccine and look for any signals in unique populations. That is very a robust system, and that's how we will learn if there's any unique populations that have a different outcome.
I just want a quick clarification, Dr. Lee, when you mentioned that you read the paper about increased rates of complications, you're not referring from the vaccine or trials.
No, apologies. From COVID
Thank you.
COVID infection, yes. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah.
I should mention that Dr. Brooks is on the line, and Dr. Schechter also have been critical components of the conversations around ACIP and the COVID vaccines work group. So they are your resident experts as well.
Thanks, Grace. Let's go on to David Lown. David, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, David Lown, represents CMO from the California Public Hospitals and Healthcare Systems. Dr. Sawyer, I'm really glad you mentioned my favorite topic, which is the need for masking and distancing post-vaccine, particularly in light of the, I'd say, very unfortunate statements made by Dr. Fauci earlier this week that we're going to could reach herd immunity by March, April, or May with enough vaccine. Head explodes. I seem to recall hearing on the Pfizer hearing last week that the Pfizer representative said that their primate trials showed, quote, some intermittent prevention of upper respiratory infection. Some and intermittent sounds weird. They also seem to, I think they said that they were going to do continued studies on prevention of infection post-vaccination. So I want to know if you had any information on that. And then lastly, to your post-marketing trials, how are we going to combine COVID testing information with vaccination of people to gather more of that data? Thank you.
Yeah, so the issue of, sorry, I blanked on your first question. Just give me the highlight word again.
Oh, the Pfizer said they were going to continue doing studies.
Yeah, so they are going to study their clinical trial is slated to go for 2 years. So they're going to continue to follow all of the participants in the trial. And so they said that they would be pulling out a subset of them and obtaining some culture information to see if they are asymptomatic and infected and could potentially transmit. You're right that their animal model data suggested that that might be the case, but it's really insufficient for us to reach any conclusion. So I think we're going to learn mostly from groups like the first vaccinees, the healthcare workers, because at the same time, many health systems are testing their personnel every week. So we'll very quickly be able to see if people who received the vaccine, when they're tested afterwards, whether they no longer ever have the virus in their nose and throat. And that'll be the first real signal that we're going to, be able to rely on these vaccines to cut transmission. Far be it from me to question Dr. Fauci, but certainly it's very hard to know what the uptake is going to be of vaccine. And until we get the answer to your question, we're not going to know whether we're going to get herd immunity to the level we need.
And I saw in the chat from Dr. Wasserman that the Moderna shows some evidence of that they may have studied it already a little bit.
They did a culture right before the second dose, and the preliminary data from that suggested less carriage, but there still was some. So again, we're going to have to sort this out over time.
Great. Thank you, David, for that great question. Andy, let's go to you, and then we'll go to Ronnie Kelly, and then we'll thank Grace and Mark for being with us today, which has been incredible. Go ahead, Andy. Introduce yourself.
Andy Imparato with Disability Rights California. Thanks again for the opportunity. I just wanted to follow up on Aaron Carruthers' question, but get a little more granular. the disability community is very diverse. The intellectual and developmental disability community is very diverse. So what is going to be helpful to me and Aaron and other messengers is to know what do we know about the vaccine for people with Down syndrome? What do we know about the vaccine for people with MS? What do we know about the vaccine for people with adrenoleukodystrophy or any number of other conditions? And I'm just wondering, I'm guessing that we don't have granular information about these populations right now. So I'm wondering, is there a national or global effort to get that granular information as we deploy the vaccines? And could that actually affect who gets selected for early participation in a vaccine? If we have people who want to be part of early testing as a way to get you more information that you can share with a broader population, is that even a consideration?
So that's a great question. I would say that ACIP has left the recommendations as the FDA AUA has indicated, which is 16 and older. We don't have any contraindications. So we are actually encouraging individuals to make that decision to get vaccinated. You mentioned a very diverse group of individuals with different comorbidities. And again, I anticipate, for example, that we do have healthcare personnel with some of these conditions, and we do have essential workers who have some of these conditions. And the benefits for vaccination may really outweigh any potential unknown risks at this point, or known risks at this point. And so in that instance, our hope is that with time, we will be able to, and I know CDC, FDA, and other federal agencies will certainly be monitoring safety in broad populations. In addition, I understand that CDC also, as well as asking the manufacturers to study longer term effectiveness or observational data in more diverse populations that are being vaccinated. So again, I hope we will learn over time. I'm not aware of any specific trials to encourage enrollment in, although I am aware of trials being developed or in process for pregnant women and for young children. So I think those are the two populations we anticipate moving forward for sure. And then there are also many communities that exist where I am aware of clinical registries where individuals or communities have come together and actually contributed data on their population or their subpopulation in order to capture as much information as possible. I am not aware of the specific registries in your communities that you mentioned, but would be happy to try and find colleagues who might be able to help.
Thank you, Andy. Ronnie, why don't we take your question now? Introduce yourself.
Ronnie Kelly, I'm representing the County Behavioral Health Directors Association. And my question really is tied to what both Aaron and Andy were talking about with disabilities. So I'm wondering about comorbidities of mental illness, since 1 in 5 folk have one. It doesn't have to be the far end with schizophrenia, but any of the other lower end, maybe anxiety disorder, major depression, and or a substance use disorder. And if that information was called out at all about people actively using or people receiving medicated assisted treatment.
Yeah, I can just comment at the FDA level, the data was not that granular. People with those sorts of underlying risk factors were not probably enrolled in the trials, or if they were, they weren't identified and stratified as such. So, there's no particular reason to think they're going to have a different safety profile than others, but that's the kind of thing that we monitor as large numbers of people start to get immunized, and we'll find out if something surprises us.
Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time for this discussion, and I have the honor of working with the scientific review work group. And I just want to reassure you that there are 15 other physician scientists, just like Mark and Grace, who have met together weekly. They met from Thursday night through Sunday to review the FDA data on the Pfizer vaccine. And we'll be starting up again this Thursday through the weekend on the Moderna vaccine. They are just an incredible group. And I just want to say from everyone, thank you, Mark and Grace, for being with us today. It's been extremely informative, and we'll look forward to more conversations like this. And Dr. Burke-Harris and Dr. Pon, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Bobby. And I want to echo Bobby's thanks to Dr. Sawyer and Dr. Lee. Move the conversation forward now to a conversation as we have learned more about vaccine safety, really thinking about some of our messages to support vaccine acceptability, community engagement, and how we're messaging to our diverse communities across the state of California. And so why don't we go ahead to the next slide. I'll start by sharing our fabulous new logo and Vaccinate All 58, really highlighting the importance of rolling this out across our 58 counties in California, and really highlighting that together we can end the pandemic. Doesn't that sound good? Oh my goodness. I have to say that sounds really good right now. And so as we move forward in this work and really highlight how we're doing this work in our, and really working to engage our communities across California, one of the things that we have heard from you all is the importance of making sure that we are tailoring our messaging and our methodologies of reaching out to our vulnerable communities, to all of our communities, but especially our vulnerable communities. And if we can move forward with the next slide. We wanted to share with you some of the key principles that are grounding our work in message development and message strategy. So the first key principle is an acknowledgement of the complex and nuanced personal and community experiences that folks have had, and an understanding that lived experience shapes the willingness to accept the vaccine. We want to affirm our commitment to engagement by partnering with all our diverse communities across the state to share knowledge and information about the COVID vaccines. And action by providing everyone living in California with culturally competent, fact-based messages so that they can make an informed decision to vaccinate. And we would love to start by hearing from you high-level feedback on our on these key principles that are guiding our work. And you know, keep in mind, we're not gonna rewrite all the principles right now with 70 people on the line, but really thinking about our high-level feedback in terms of does this sound right? What are your high-level reactions, and any suggestions for improvements or thoughts?
Great. So if you would just signify that you would like to make a comment by using the hand raise function. And again, just to reiterate what Dr. Burke-Harris said, big picture, what's missing, what should be emphasized that maybe isn't in terms of concepts. So let's start with Denny Chan from Justice and Aging, and then we'll go to Amanda, and then we'll go to Deborah. Denny?
Hi, I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, Denny Chan from Justice and Aging. Thanks. Really appreciate the language on the principles and support sort of what you've laid out here. The one thing that I would add from a high level that I think is critical to the success of the rollout of the vaccine is really not just engaging partners, but learning from partners about who are the trusted messengers and what messages work. I'm particularly concerned as we think about vaccines dropping just early as next week in long-term care facilities that we haven't done that exploration yet. We don't know, what messages will work. It's going to be CVS and Walgreens coming in, and I'm not sure they're the trusted messengers, honestly, for these populations. So I would really encourage, sort of on that note about engagement, to learn from the communities that we're trying to get vaccinated on what the message is that works and who are those trusted messengers are. Thank you.
Thank you, Denny. And we're going to be talking more and more about this after we talk about principles. We've got some questions to pose to you all that will get at some of those issues. So let's go to Amanda, and then we'll go to Deborah, and then we'll go to Orville. Amanda, don't forget to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Bobby. Hi, all. Amanda McAllister-Wallner, she, her, hers with the California LGBTQ Health and Human Services Network. Completely agree with Denny. I think who those messages are coming from is very important, and have been told as much by numerous folks in the communities that I work with. I think on the first principle, where we're talking about kind of acknowledging the complex and nuanced personal and community experiences, I think it might be a good idea to start by acknowledging histories of racism, homophobia that have led to some of those, some of that distrust of institutions, distrust of these systems. And I think that's one thing that we should just say and acknowledge, for why there might be hesitancy. And then one other piece is I think we should be proactive in trying to understand where some of this hesitancy is coming from, or why people might resist. One example that comes to mind is I've been asked a ton by folks, if I have X pre-existing condition, can I, is it safe for me to be vaccinated? And I think that, while we might not be able to answer all of those questions, I think the more information we have, the more information we can get to people to encourage them to talk to their doctor about this, that, this is, a good idea. The more we can get out there on the front end, and the less that we're relying on individuals to be the ones responsible for finding the answers to those questions and talking to their doctors without any, hope that it'll work. I think that will be, really impactful and getting folks to think, yes, this seems like something I should, that is for me, or that I should, look into.
Great, thank you, Amanda. And we have a number of comments in the chat about transparency. So after we hear a few more comments, I'm going to ask Dr. Burke-Harris to comment on how that might, how she thinks that might be incorporated into these principles. But let's go to Deborah, and then Orville, and then Christina, and then we'll try to get to Crystal before we have to move on to our next part of this discussion.
Deborah Shade, California School Board Association. Just a quick comment in the principles. So one thing that is not acknowledged is that this is such a unique situation where this has been a fast development of a vaccine. I think when you layer that on top of all the other issues, that compounds it. And so just addressing the hesitancy without the elephant that's in the room of, we've never done this before, we have some distrust from the way it was rolled out, and the speed, I think, would be important as well to add to that.
Great feedback, Deborah. Thank you. Orville, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. Orville Thomas from the California Immigrant Policy Center. Just have a couple of points. One, language access. So far, I think we've seen the Vaccinate ALL 58 in only English and Spanish. Is there a plan for broader accessibility for like multiple languages for immigrant communities? And then second, is there an opportunity to learn from the work that the Complete Count folks have done in the Department of Social Services Immigrant Service Program has done already regarding trusted messengers, the amounts of touches that need to happen in each community, and where there are pockets of ethnic populations that need the extra investments, and then who are the organizations that have the deep ties? It just seems like the state already knows some of this information, so hoping that we've partnered across the silos to build on that and not start from scratch.
Great point, Orville. I think we'll hear a little bit more about that, both from Dr. Burke-Harris and from Maricela Rodriguez in just a few minutes. So thanks for bringing those issues up. Christina.
Hi, everyone. Christina Mills, Executive Director of the California Foundation for Independent Living Centers. I do agree with the comments made in the chat, transparency, and wondering if it fits under the second area of a commitment to transparency and engagement. But I also wanted to bring up the language level here and making sure that it's accessible to people of all different types of reading levels. And typically we try to stay a lower or at a 5th grade reading level to make it accessible for people with all types of disabilities. If we can use pictures or graphics to also display what we're trying to get across, that is helpful. I also think, to Andy and Aaron's points earlier, safety is among the most important factor for our community as people with disability across the spectrum. And I think if there is some way to include transparency and safety, meaning that we really don't know what the safety is for people with comorbidities or pre-existing conditions, that we're just being honest and real and we're learning together. But some way to put in safety seems to be really important to make sure that we're being inclusive. And then in the area of paragraph 2, I know we say diverse communities, but so often people with disabilities and the general public do not necessarily find that people with disabilities fit in there. So if we could add diverse communities, including people with disabilities or disabled people, that would be great. And then to the point of language, it would be wonderful if we are going to offer any type of videos specifically to market and outreach, that we also make sure that we do videos in American Sign Language by deaf community members.
So many great suggestions. Thank you, Christina. Crystal?
Hi there, Crystal Crawford, Western Center on Law and Poverty. Building upon the spirit in Principle 2, I would go a step further and say committed to engaging by partnering with and following the lead of our diverse communities across the state about the best way to share knowledge about the COVID vaccines. Because I think that's where you're headed, but if you take the language a step further, it really, I think, strengthens the partner language and the fact that communities are experts that we need, and we need their voices.
Well said, Crystal. Thank you. Dr. Burke-Harris, would you like to make a few comments before we go on to our next set of questions for the group?
Sure, I'm happy to. So first of all, thank you so much. I'm absolutely thrilled by this level of engagement, and this is the type of input and wisdom that we were hoping to receive from this effort. I failed to mention in the introduction that we have joining us in today's meeting a few really key folks. From the governor's office and from the Department of Public Health, who are really leading these efforts. And so you'll hear in just a little bit from some of our team from Marisela in the governor's office, Marisela Rodriguez, who is leading some of this message development. But I also want to highlight some of the other folks who we invited. Sue Ann Buggy, who is working with our Department of Public Health to help craft these messages, and really thinking about what you all just said about engagement with our trusted messengers and our community leaders. We've invited Kathleen Kelly-Janis, who is the director of the Governor's Office for Social Innovation, who really leads our engagement with partnering with philanthropy and partnering with our social innovators across the state, who are really, as you all mentioned, the folks who are on the ground, who are engaging with communities, who are of community and serving community, and really speak to much of that wisdom. And the reason that we invited Sue Ann, Marisela, and Kathleen to be part of this discussion is to hear directly from you all of this really valuable input and information as we're moving forward to developing these messages and strategies for engaging communities around vaccine acceptance and transparently communicating around safety and efficacy. So we're very grateful for that. I want to speak to one other piece that was mentioned in terms of the complete count, and recognizing that that is one of the things that we are thinking about, is really engaging with the census infrastructure, because we recognize that we've already done a tremendous amount of work in California with partnering with trusted messengers to reach our many diverse communities across the state of California. So that excellent suggestion is a tool that we recognize as part of our toolkit, and that's something that we are looking into. I want to move forward now to the next slide and pose a question to this group. So this is a key, some of this came up already, but we'd love to hear explicit feedback on this question. What do you perceive are the most common barriers and hesitancy factors among high-risk communities? And I want to highlight that, of course, we want to think about, when we look at our messaging, we want to think specifically among our high-risk communities, but really among all of our communities, or among the communities that you represent. What do you see as some of the most common barriers and hesitancy factors?
Great. Okay. Well, I know everybody's got lots of important things to say here. So let's start with Susan, and then we'll go to Jose. Susan, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi there, I'm Susan DeMorris with the Alzheimer's Association, and I've been polling our 21 offices around the state and our constituents. So in addition to what we're hearing, obviously, with the African American and Latino communities, I think specific to the Alzheimer's population in long-term care, many family members have not seen their loved one in person for months on end, and they're concerned about their frailty, and they don't have a good read right now on how resilient they are for the side effects of the vaccine. So I would just urge us to make sure that adult children are part of our audience for messaging, because it may be a family member or an elderly spouse who needs to hear the message because they're already concerned about weight loss and depression and other things that have been occurring in recent months.
Thank you for bringing that up. So important. Jose, do you want to go next? And then we'll go to Tia and then Ronnie.
Yes, Jose Padilla, State Director, California Rural Legal Assistance. We have a network of 16 offices throughout California, primarily in rural counties. Just some real brief statements around the barriers. Because we work heavily in the Latino immigrant community, just like as with the African American community, the history, the legacy of discrimination obviously is an obstacle that's really obvious. But also there in our community is a distrust of the United States government for a lot of reasons, particularly because of the whole issue of legality and illegality in immigrant communities, and especially realizing that there are a lot of our families that are mixed when you talk about immigrant status. And so to the extent that you're going to have folks that are here legally and others who are not within the same family, and even within the extended family, you have a big barrier there with you wanting to trust government. The other issue with these communities is the fact that a lot of them are impoverished. They live in poverty, and the lack of health insurance is going to be a huge obstacle. The very basic question of who will pay. I mean, those are just very basic questions that will arise. The other issue around immigration that I forgot is, and it relates to pay, is that remember that within the immigration framework, the whole issue of public charge, that that you are going to be, if you want to legalize one of the questions is, have you been a public charge in the past? Have you used public benefits? That is a very critical factor, a big factor in the immigrant community as they look at the benefits of this public service, because at some point they will have to answer that question. And so we have to be messaging that. Finally, just to agree with the statements around utilizing the census experiences and networks that already exist. Critical, and I'll shut up.
Please don't, Jose. Thank you for those great comments. Let's go to Tia, and then Ronnie, and then Genevieve, and then Kim, and then it looked like Jody Hicks also had her hand raised. So Tia.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. So I just echo the comments that were previously stated.
Introduce yourself. Tia, introduce yourself.
I'm sorry. Hi, Tia Orr from the Service Employees International Union. Hi, everybody. So would like to echo the comments that were previously mentioned. Obviously, we're seeing a lot of concern from communities of color. I think that goes with, education and us getting the word out. I can't echo Denny's comments enough about who the messengers are. Of course, we as the union want to be helpful in that regard, but that comes with the necessary education and material and talking points and all the good stuff that we need to get that message out there to our workers. I think we're also hearing a lot of safety concerns, right? On some of the side effects and the impacts that your previous presenters just put out there. I think workers have those overall concerns, want to be able to ask those questions, and want to make sure who's ever administering the vaccine, they can ask those questions too. They're trained well enough to respond to those risks if they occur. I hear some folks are having folks stay 30 to 15 minutes after the vaccine. What are some of those protocols? Again, education, making people feel comfortable and safe. And we've also heard some recent concerns just about HIPAA violations, right? SEIU and representation of workers, right? We know that our employers are going to get information about who is going to get vaccinated. Some of the medical information that's not usually shared with your employer is going to be out there. And then, just following that up with what you guys heard from us on the last call, in response to that, is there potential retaliation? Is there potential side effects where you're going to need sick leave and other worker protections that I know we're going to continue pushing forward, again, to instill that confidence among the workforce and really try to get those barriers out the way that you asked about. So those are my comments for SEIU.
Thank you, Tia. Ronnie, and then we'll go to Genevieve.
Hi, Ronnie Kelly, County Behavioral Health Directors Association. One of the big risks or barriers and hesitancies among those who are living with a mental illness is just that they have a mental illness. Oftentimes they're symptomatic, which means that they might really have a high level of paranoia. And getting an injection from the government is probably, where they live oftentimes when they're symptomatic. On top of that, what we do know is that they trust their clinicians, they trust their psychiatrists. So it would be really important that the people who would be dispensing the vaccine to this group of people would be their mental health professionals. They have an inherent mistrust of the medical system overall, CS as being separate from the medical system, and really identify the medical system as where they went when they were 5158 and put in restraints. So really important to understand the context of their lived experience. Thank you.
Yeah, really good point, Ronnie. Thank you. Genevieve, and then we'll go to Kim.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Genevieve, Associate Director with Mixteco Indígena Community Organizing Project in Ventura and Santa Barbara counties. I will try and be succinct and not too fast for the interpreters. But we've been conducting groups with our Indigenous farm worker community, both in Santa Maria and Oxnard, and the preliminary findings, even from one this week, was one of our farm workers in Mixteco had told us that, even if it's free, like the flu vaccine, they're not going to get it because they'll get the flu vaccine and then they'll get sick. A lot of what we're hearing from our staff is that our community doesn't know what's in it. As you can imagine, I know there are lists of what's in the vaccine, but those are really, they're scientific, right? And for us to put those in our Indigenous languages is going to be difficult. And so we're going to have to figure out how to workshop around that. They think it's still too experimental, like in other communities. They think that it'll do more damage than good because there's so many unknowns. And a lot of our folks would rather use home remedies, similar to what they do when they get the flu. They'd rather use their herbs and their teas to get them through it. There is the big picture of just a lack of medical home. A lot of our community members go to clinics where they get injected with God knows what, but it's very similar to the model they're used to in Mexico, but at least they can trust that. They know that because it feels very similar to what they get in Mexico. There's also a concern about the price with some folks, and then the impact to work. And I think overall what we're seeing both with the vaccine and with COVID-19 is just the overall stigma. There's a stigma, a real stigma that's attached to COVID-19 within our communities and not wanting to get it and not wanting to even furthermore be vaccinated against it. And so those are some preliminary findings that are coming up for us as we continue to talk to community. Thank you.
Thank you, Genevieve. And thank you all for reaching out into your communities and bringing all of that back. I mean, that was the whole intention here. So those of you that have made that huge effort, it's so important. Let's go to Kim, and then we'll go to Jody Hicks, and then we'll go to Dr. Luther, and we'll see how much time we have left in this section. Kim?
Thank you. This is Kim Sarawatari, Public Health Director for Riverside County and representing public health directors in California. I just wanted to add to some of the discussion in terms of engaging the church community. And so just the example of farm workers in Riverside County, when we were going out and attempting to test them with some of our community-based organizations, we had more success engaging with the community-based organizations, but when we brought in the Catholic Church in that community, we saw a 10-fold increase in our testing. And I think that that is a model that we should be mindful of as we look at vaccinations. Particularly the Catholic Archdiocese had originally said they were not supporting the vaccine because of its limited connection to abortion. And now they've come out and said that they are supporting it. And we've seen some change already in sentiment among the community. So I think engagement with the church community is also really important as we go forward.
Thank you, Kim. And for those of you that want to see the Catholic Archdiocese statement, it was included in the public comment packet for our last meeting. So you can reference it there if you still have those materials, or it's posted on the website as well. Let's go on to Jody and then Dr. Luther.
Hi, Jody Hicks with Planned Parenthood Affiliates of California. And just want to echo really what everyone has talked about insofar as being the messenger being really important for communities and how they receive information and receive the vaccine. But I think part of it is, I know this focus, and maybe there's a focus around access later, but the focus has been about education and so far as hesitancy and folks wanting the vaccine and ensuring that it's safe. But I think as much attention needs to be just in terms of barriers to preventive medicine in across the board, and why that exists everywhere else will continue to exist for this particular vaccine. So, you know, in many of these communities, they'll only go to the doctor when something is wrong. So to, you know, get the travel that's necessary, time off work that's necessary, all of those things to receive something preventive is something that requires outreach and what we use patient navigators for and things like that. And I think in order for trusted messengers to be able to do that work that needs to be done to get folks to come in and receive a vaccination that requires time off work and all of those things, that will also require investments in all of those other areas. So whether it's promotores and using the right language, patient navigators that have the right language and access to patients, also ensuring that when there's reporting mechanisms, especially for the undocumented population, that they are safe and in a safe environment. All of that's going to be important, but it's also going to take investments in those clinics or healthcare workers to do that outreach. So I think, you know, recognizing barriers to access to care that already exists is an important part of this, because folks that are going to go into a Walgreens or a CVS, I think are already going to want the vaccine. It's how we outreach everyone else that normally has a hard time getting preventive care in the first place is another important piece to address. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jody. really important issue around access. Dr. Luther?
Yes, thanks, Bobby. I'm Jeff Luther. Excuse me. I'm representing the California Academy of Family Physicians, and I'm a family physician practicing in Long Beach. And I think as we're looking at hesitancy factors, what we're seeing a lot in downtown Long Beach is much of what the rest of you are seeing, which is fear and a desire for reassurance that they can trust. And so as we're looking at avenues for outreach and trust building, we really need to take advantage of existing relationships, of which there are many, and empower them. In our practice, somewhere between 60 and 70% of our patients are represented amongst these communities that we're talking about, the communities that have been harder hit. And for people who have a relationship with a community health center or a private practice or a clinic, they hopefully have a connection with their doctor or their healthcare provider, but they also connect with staff in the office. Our nursing staff is almost entirely from these communities that we're trying to reach. And I met with 20 of our nurses this morning who are eager for easy to use information, facts, ways to back up the conversations they have with patients, because they're having people from their own communities asking them, what do you think about this? Because it's one thing to try to talk to the doctor about it, but they have many-year trusting relationships with a medical assistant or a LVN. And I think finding ways to empower the people who are already as part of those relationships to get the word out will really amplify our message. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And a really new point to be emphasized in terms of who else will be standing with all of you to deliver these messages. We've got a second question that I want to move on to, and I've got note that Dr. Wasserman, Carolyn, Lisa, and Laura wanted to make a comment on this first question. Let's see if you have some feedback on the second question is all. And Liu, I see your name also. Let's move on to the second question. Dr. Burke-Harris, do you want to say anything to introduce question number 2?
No, I think I'm just going to jump right in, other than to say how grateful that I am for all of this really strong feedback about the barriers and hesitancy factors. And now we are going to dive in and tap into our community strengths, right? And ask the question, what are the perceived motivations for vaccine acceptance among high-risk communities? So that's, I'm excited to hear what people are thinking about this.
Great. So those of you that had your hands raised, I bet you can turn your answer around to this question. If you can, let's go for it. And if not, please just pass. So Dr. Wasserman, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, you're exactly right. And actually, I've been giving talks all week to folks about how to increase vaccine confidence. So I'm actually trying not even to use the word hesitancy and use positive words to message. I think the key though, and I made this in the chat room, but I wanted to say it, we have to first hear the concerns of folks before we even try to explain the positives or before we even try to respond to their questions. If they don't feel heard, we are going to have a lot of problems. And I think one of the things we don't fully comprehend is if we don't take the time and the patience to do it, there will be folks who will get vaccinated, and for the rest of their lives, they will blame us for forcing them to get vaccinated. And this is not the time to do that. We've been doing that for too many years. So I think that the number one message I would give, especially for my white professional colleagues who think that everyone's going to accept the vaccine, is put ourselves in the folks' places who are resistant, who are and truly have some patience. I know it's hard right now. We want everyone to get vaccinated, but we have to breathe and take some time and hear their concerns and walk them through it. And if we don't agree, we can't tell them we don't agree. We can't tell them they're wrong. We have to continue to stay the course and work with them on this. And I think that's the way we're going to motivate people, is by hearing their concerns and letting them know that we respect, honor, and value them. Those are the 3 words I've been using constantly for the last 3 days.
Great advice. Thank you, Dr. Wasserman. Carolyn, let's go to you. Don't forget to introduce yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. My name is Carolyn. I'm calling from the California Indian Health Service, California area office. So there are 109 federally recognized tribes in the state of California. In one meeting, we were talking about vaccinations and what could be a motivating factor. A tribal member mentioned that a conspiracy theory on vaccination. However, when I reframed the question, another tribal member put it into a framework that they understood. And they said that they were using vaccinations in another way by inoculating themselves with plants that were indigenous to the region. And by explaining in this terms, it was understood by other tribal members that vaccinations were part of their culture. I bring this up because I think this is part of the language that needs to be used in indigenous communities, acknowledging traditional medicine, but also talking about how vaccinations play a part in traditional medicine and how this vaccination is not that much different compared to other vaccinations that they've had. So that's what I wanted to bring up in terms of how we can motivate vaccine acceptance using current examples from indigenous communities to reach out to these particular groups. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. It's great to hear from a pharmacist. And I know you've been talking to Dr. Thomas Kim from the California Rural Indian Health Board and Virginia Hedrick from the California Urban Indian Health Organization about these issues. Virginia had to step away and Thomas had a family emergency, so he's not with us today. Let's go to Lisa Hershey and then to Laura.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Hershey. I represent Housing California. We're a statewide nonprofit advocacy organization advancing bills on homelessness and affordable housing, creating a California with homes, health, and prosperity for all. I shared briefly last week, I was talking to one of my board members, Dr. Margot Kuchel, who also is a leading researcher at the intersection of health, healthcare, and homelessness. And they've been doing outreach into communities of unsheltered populations. Primarily, they started around the COVID testing to determine why folks weren't getting tested and what would change that situation. What they found was that when the homeless service providers went out with the medical staff to meet the people where they lived and listen and demonstrated care and value and already had a trusted relationship, they were much more likely to get tested. There was also related research on how do you feel about the vaccine. And what the preliminary findings showed is that although some of these folks were resistant to the flu vaccine, they were equal or greater, their probability of acceptability of the vaccine was equal or greater to the general population based on the research. And these findings are still being analyzed, but it was fascinating to learn and, digging deeper into it, which they're continuing to do. Part of it is the listening to folks, demonstrating the care and the trust, but also that risk benefit ratio, right? Like folks are very, very afraid of getting COVID and dying right now in certain communities. And so part of what these folks have been doing is really building the narrative around why this vaccine will create better outcomes. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Lisa. Laura, let's go to you, and then Liu, let's go to you. Laura, let's see. Are you on mute, Laura? Yeah, Laura, we can't hear you.
Can you?
Now we can. There you go.
Ah, great. Thanks, Bobby. Hi, Laura Curry with the California Teachers Association. So no one wants to be back in our classrooms with our students where we know they learn best more than educators. And as this committee has already talked about, the tight interconnectedness within our schools, and we know that public education is vital to California's full recovery from this pandemic. So, this vaccine really adds an important layer of protection against the virus for safe, equitable, in-person instruction. So I think that's a high motivation. I think, you know, as we've talked about before and others on this committee have raised, you know, there is an interconnectedness where the schools are the heart of our community. And we have really seen in this pandemic where health equity and educational equity are inextricably linked. And we've seen many parents have been rightfully concerned about the safety of the school site, many choosing to stay in distance learning, a phenomena that occurred recently in New York schools, with, you know, which have had lower community infection rates than California counties. So as many non-white families have not been ready to send their children back to the classroom due to the harsh and disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on communities of color that this committee has taken very seriously and underscored, this vaccine becomes a very important layer. And, you know, as we've talked about before, ways in which educators, school staff in schools, and the students' parents who are essential workers, parents, guardians, household members who are essential workers, can be vaccinated together at the same time to provide greater wraparound protection on the COVID prevention and safety front, and to be able to signal greater confidence for our broader communities. So I hope that in our rollout, we will consider those things. And then really just to underscore again what Dr. Lown and Dr. Sawyer and Dr. Brooks have mentioned, the full effect of the vaccine on transmission isn't known yet. So we can't lose sight of the importance of regular testing, face covering, physical distance, all those mitigation measures. They are going to remain critical. And when we have those in place, that too will signal greater confidence in our programs. So we're excited to work with this committee to put together a really robust and effective rollout for 1B.
Okay, and that's up after the break. So thank you, Laura. Let's go to Leu, and then we'll go to Sylvia Yee, and then we'll go to Matt Maldonado, and then we're going to stop because we have a little bit more information we want to give. And if we have extra time at the end of that, we'll come back to Anthony and Mike. So Leu, why don't you go next and introduce yourself?
Hey guys, Leu Mafi here from, I'm actually in Stockton, California, but I am representing Victory and Praise Church located here in Stockton. It's kind of a twofold thing. So let's go with the barriers and the hesitancy. We already talked about that, so I won't even talk too much about it. But it would be the opposite for us. So how are we motivating our communities to accept it? You got to think about the communities like smaller cities like Stockton, which are pretty large, but still small in essence to larger cities and communities throughout California. Our families that are being represented and, you know, the Black and Brown communities that are getting their information in smaller cities like ours are only getting it via news. So when we talk about who these messengers are, I literally had my grandma say, I don't know about the vaccine because she saw something on the news, which ended up being her hesitancy. And in the churches, a large amount of people who are still in the churches are our older generations. So that just goes to show who are they speaking to? They're having conversations with their children. So that goes to show our intergenerational connections are huge right now. So we have to make sure, I heard somebody mention earlier in regards to communities where it's low income, which means that there's multi-generational families living in the homes. So who's communicating to who and where are these conversations coming from? So if we can make sure, I think some of the motivations would be, one, when we're going out, can we make sure that there's representation of different races and cultures that are being put out there? So if I see somebody like my culture, I come from a small family. So if I see other families from Samoan cultures or Polynesian cultures that are out there being represented, getting the vaccine, my motivation would be a little bit higher than those if I see those of my counterparts that aren't being represented. So I would just encourage that we get that information out to smaller communities, those of Black and Brown communities, and those of, and try not to mix both, you know, clump us all together, because all of our, you know, information would be completely different. And I know that's just a lot of different things, but I think that would be a great way to, you know, motivate communities like ours that are just super diverse. I think it would just be a little bit more effort that would go into those that are actually on the ground as well.
Thank you for those comments. Sylvia?
Hi, this is Sylvia Yee. I'm a staff attorney with Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund. I'm just zeroing in a little bit on a point that I think has already been raised, which is I think the good of the community is a very strong motivation, but it's really important to understand what people consider their community, and sometimes that can be very specific. So being clear about that, and that what the community needs is not just vaccination, because vaccination isn't this cure-all, no matter what some people say, but that it's part of a overall program, that physical distance, that the community still needs physical distance, masks, testing, limiting large gatherings, and yes, vaccinations. This I do think that when we think of communities, it's not necessarily people who are just exactly like us, but that community includes our family, which can and does include different ages. That it includes people with and without disabilities. It includes people who look like us on the surface and people who are like us below the skin level. And there's just a kind of messaging I think that can go out that can really help with that. And we just have to put aside the assumptions about who people think their communities are. And that, of course, requires that kind of listening that others have already emphasized on this list. And building part of that trust is I have to say, being very specific about the kinds of priorities that have already been set. And I know we've talked about 1A, and that we've been given the list of what CDPH says is in 1A, but it's still specifics are important. And if some of those specifics are going to be decided just at county levels, then people need to know that too, because then they can mobilize at the county level.
Thank you, Sylvia. No, thank you. Matt, you get the last word here before we talk a little bit more about this issue with Maricela.
Yeah, thank you. This is Matthew, United Domestic Workers. Everything was said, and so I lowered my hand. I just wanted to ditto some of the stuff that folks are saying. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's nice to hear your voice. And Mike and Anthony, we'll come back to you if we have a few more minutes. Dr. Burke-Harris, do you want to introduce Maricela?
Yes, but first I want to just say thank you to everyone for this incredible feedback. This is truly very, very valuable to us, and I want to let all of you know that this input will go into the work that we are doing. So we are incredibly grateful. And speaking of which, I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague Maricela Rodriguez from the governor's office. She's going to share a little bit more about our Vaccinate All 58 campaign.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Burke-Harris, and I appreciate the opportunity to get this insight and this input very early on in the process. So thank you so much for everything that has been shared. I wanted just to, maybe before I start, I just wanted to maybe say a couple of things. This feedback is incredibly helpful. I also helped oversee the census work. And so it gives me great joy to hear so many people talking about how do we leverage the success, the learnings, and the networks of the census, but not only the census, but also the work that the other folks have done, including the Department of Social Services. And, I also think about our Listos campaigns, and all of those folks are being engaged and thinking through how we leverage those learnings, the network of trusted messengers. So I'm happy to hear that we're on the right track there. We are, as we jump into this, maybe I can touch on some other points that I kind of scribbled on here as well. So if you want to flip to the next slide. And maybe it'll, do we have the video?
We have the video, so we're going to switch over to the video. We don't have it on this, we have it separately on a link. So we'll go to the video now.
Okay, maybe while it comes up, I wanted to, many of you saw the governor help unveil this earlier this week. Oh, let's go ahead and see if it'll play.
It will, we tried it.
Great, it'll probably glitch a little bit, but it's an animated version of the logo to show you that, part of the goal in the thinking behind this brand was to have a localized opportunity to encourage that further local engagement. You know, from the very beginning, have that be something that was very intentional. How can we localize our approach? How can we engage partners on the ground? And think about this from a community perspective. So appreciate the remarks that our Surgeon General made earlier and the emphasis on all. And so wanted to also point out, you know, we also wanted to make sure that this was, you know, based on some of the preliminary information that we have and research that we have, making it and feedback was just making sure that this was clearly a campaign about a vaccine, and that it would be positive, that it would have some nod or convey a light at the end of the tunnel. As you know, as much as we talked about barriers, we also talked about motivators. Folks are really looking for that light at the end of the tunnel, but also some sense of empowerment, and how the end of the pandemic is resonating more than COVID-19. So thinking through how those elements could be conveyed in a name, in a tagline. And you can go to the next slides. So we have pulled together, we are translating the tagline into various languages, and you can go to the next slide too. We're just showing 3 here for versus the 58, but also, going to do that for all of the different counties. So you'll have a county logo plus the translation in various languages for the tagline. So you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So just what we were able to roll out this week, some of you actually mentioned some of these key points. The message sort of the messaging that was prioritized as we rolled out this week was just really pressing on the safety and effectiveness of the vaccine. There's a lot of questions around that, a lot of concerns around that. So how do we ensure that that's part of our messaging from the start? And how do we also really manage expectations as well? And this is, also going to be a part of the challenging work up ahead, is that this is a phased distribution. So yes, the vaccine is here, but it's a phased approach. And so how do we communicate that to people so that they understand how this is going to work? And then, as many of you also mentioned, the need to continue to practice those safety precautions, including wearing a mask. We are also in the middle of a surge. So as much as we also are noting, yes, there is a vaccine, we're also in the middle of a surge. So being able to integrate that messaging is going to be critical. So some of our materials in our toolkits you'll see, and all of this will continue to roll out. Yes, we did start with English and Spanish, but throughout the next couple of days, if you go to our COVID website, in our toolkit section, a lot of other languages are going to start to roll out. And some of what you will find in our toolkit includes a fact sheet. Again, this will be in language, some graphics that folks can pick up and help amplify. We also wanted to put testimonials as part of the mix, because as folks have talked about, trusted messengers are key. So we have, a video up at the top that should be uploaded if it isn't already, explaining a little bit about the vaccines. It's a little bit of a longer video that is meant to be kind of an explainer and why it's important, and some history on the vaccine. And then, testimonials like the ICU nurse that received her vaccine just this week, Helen Cordova. Those testimonials are going to be critical as well. So we want to collect those stories and be able to share them and amplify them, because storytelling, as many of you are familiar, is really critical to the work. Not only do we have trusted messengers, and that may be the typical trusted messengers, but testimonials are also critical and serve as trusted messengers, from a peer-to-peer perspective. So we want to be able to include storytelling in our work as well. And And, the work that we want to do moving forward does include not only having content that's in language, but how is it also going to be responsive to reading levels, and how, some of the tactics that you mentioned, like how do we include maybe things that are like pictures or graphics, things like that can help explain what's done in text. So all of those things are things that we are considering and thinking about as we move forward. And how do we continue sort of this information loop is really important, because as much as we want to create information that's reliable and accurate and actionable, we also want to hear from community as we continue in this process. One of the things that was really valuable in the census and other work that we've done is hearing what's happening in community so that we can address those issues. The issues of addressing mis and disinformation are going to be really critical. And early education is going to be the best defense that we have against tackling mis and disinformation. But having that ongoing information loop is going to be really important, so that we're hearing what are the ongoing concerns and barriers, as well as motivators, so that we can continue to refresh and update our strategy, our tactics, and our messaging. And we need your help. We would love for your participation as we continue to roll out and build this out, and amplifying some of these key messages, and leveraging what we currently have in our toolkit. So just wanted to also make that plea for help as we continue to roll this campaign out. And I think that's, I'll stop there, but appreciate the feedback again. Very helpful. Appreciation, huge appreciation.
And Maricela, we'll make sure to get you a copy of everything that's in the chat so that you and the whole team that you're working with can see not only the issues that you heard verbalized, but also the ones in the chat. Dr. Burke-Harris?
Thank you so much, Maricela, and thank you so much to all of our committee members. We heard a tremendous amount over this section around vaccine confidence. That'll be my new word, vaccine confidence. And key among them is the importance of trusted relationships, trusted messengers, trusted providers, trusted relationships. And we're also really grateful to hear not only the challenges and the concerns, but also really the motivators and how we leverage the strength and the voice and the vitality of our diverse communities across California to end this pandemic, and so with that, I want to give everyone an opportunity for self-care, because everybody knows I love self-care. And we'll take a brief 10-minute break. And, I will keep us on time. Can we say an 8-minute break? And we will reconvene at 4:55. So thank you so much. Don't forget, you can go ahead and turn your cameras off and put your phones on mute, or your microphones on mute, and we will reconvene at 4:55.
Thank you. We'll see you all back in 8 minutes. Shall we start, Nadine?
Yes. Yes. Oh, I was making sure that I was on mute, off mute. Okay, ready. And we are back. I hope that everyone had a chance to stretch their legs a little bit, perhaps hydrate, and is ready and rearing to go heading into the last hour of our meeting. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Rob Schechter, Chief of the Immunization Branch of the California Department of Public Health, to give us an update on vaccine supply and to highlight some of the answers that members raise to questions that members raise at our last meeting. So we wanted to, you all raised lots of great questions. We wanted to get your questions answered. So we would love to have Dr. Schechter respond to those questions. And then following that, we'll head into the conversation of the phase 1B allocation.
Thank you, Dr. Burke-Harris. Can you hear me okay, given my technological challenges often?
Yes,
Thank
we
you.
can hear you just fine.
Super. May I have the next slide, please? Good afternoon to everybody. So this slide is, I think, looking familiar by now, but we're about to go into one more cycle of a flurry of meetings starting tomorrow. As mentioned earlier in the call, tomorrow, Dr. Sawyer and his colleagues on the FDA Advisory Committee will be reviewing the Moderna candidate vaccine data for safety and efficacy. If they decide to recommend authorization, then the FDA leadership will review that recommendation and consider the data into the weekend. On Saturday, Dr. Lee and her colleagues on the Federal Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices will also closely review the data and then be prepared to vote on a recommendation. Should they recommend use of the Moderna vaccine, then shortly thereafter, the Scientific Safety Review Work Group is prepared to convene and review the information and make its decision or considerations to the governors of the 4 states. Last weekend, there were 2 meetings. There was a Friday meeting and the weekend meeting by the ACIP around the decision to recommend. There's also 2 emergency meetings by ACIP this weekend, but this Sunday, rather than it being about the Moderna vaccine, ACIP is meeting on an emergency basis to decide in parallel to our discussions here in the larger group and in the drafting work group to discuss who merits consideration for recommendations for being in phase 1B and beyond through the end of phase 1. So this is just new information about the agenda for the Sunday meeting, but it pertains directly to the conversation today and to the deliberations of the drafting work group as well. Next slide, please. So as in last week, I've pasted on these next few slides some of the information that the FDA committee and these other committees will be reviewing over the next days. This is data on the Moderna vaccine, candidate vaccine, showing amongst the nearly 14,000 participants that received vaccine and the similar number that received the placebo, an estimate of efficacy around 94%, very similar to the Pfizer estimate for all participants, and including 86% in those 65 and older. Next slide, please. Getting to some of the questions earlier in the meeting about comorbidity or underlying conditions, medical conditions that participants had. That's what this term at risk means here. So for those who are 18 through 64 years and at risk by having conditions such as hypertension or diabetes, also very high efficacy in the trial participants of around 95%. Next slide, please. This shows some of the estimates as well by race and ethnicity, including and showing high levels in the different groups and the different participation studied. You can see in there as well some of the numbers, so that for African American, roughly 1,400 participants in each group, whether receiving vaccine or placebo, and smaller numbers of Native populations and Asian Pacific Islander populations, and then close to 2,800 Latinx participants in the trial. Next slide, please. Some of the safety data that we'll be reviewing, similar to the Pfizer vaccine, there are frequent minor reactions that include sore arms, fatigue, headache, and muscle pain. And more so after the second dose than the first dose, in terms of the information to share with healthcare workers and others who will be receiving this at first, and the larger population as more vaccines available. I think there's been a lot of close attention to the severe allergic reactions that were noted in a few recipients in the United Kingdom and from the Pfizer vaccine. And similar to the Pfizer trial, in the larger trial of the Moderna vaccine, there was no severe allergic reactions noted. Next slide, please. So this is our current estimates, not very different from last week. This week, we're getting up to 1/3 doses into the end of the week into California for first doses, with second doses to follow in a few weeks. And then by the end of the month, slightly lower estimates, closer to 2 million, that looked like it was going to be a little bit higher. But by the end of December, hoping for 2 million of that would be a combination of Pfizer and, if authorized, Moderna vaccine. And then looking ahead into the winter and spring, perhaps as many as another 2 or more million doses in January coming, and then increasing volume month by month, including the possibility of additional vaccines in the spring. So we'll just wait and see, but going from scarcity to abundance, if all goes as projected, through the first and second quarters of the year. Next slide. So this is again a picture of the calendar for this week and going into next week, where the bulk of the remainder of the doses for Pfizer are arriving around the state today. Tomorrow, the FDA committee. Over the weekend, the Federal Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, and then another round of perhaps both vaccines arriving next week. Next slide, please. So this slide compiles some questions that were raised at last week's meeting, and hopefully some answers for you. The first question: where do people with co-occurring conditions or disabilities who are at high risk but who are not living in congregate settings fall into prioritization? And at this point, the drafting work group has been focusing on essential workers and thinking through that after considering healthcare workers and residents in congregate facilities. The committee certainly is concerned and will be considering over the next days and weeks where those with medical conditions that put them at higher risk should be, whether in 1B or in other parts. So they haven't been either ruled in or ruled out for consideration for the current phase. But we are there's further deliberation and also in parallel watching to see what the discussion is this weekend from Dr. Lee and colleagues at the Federal Advisory Committee. The next question, explain again how the pharmacy distribution to long-term care facilities will work and when will it start? There's a hyperlink in the slide to a CDC page that describes the CDC Pharmacy Partnership Program in greater length. In brief, starting the week after next, the week of December 28th, teams under CVS and Walgreens, two large commercial pharmacies, will begin to immunize the current roster would be most of the skilled nursing facilities in California over a period of weeks. And each team is currently set up for 3 visits to be able to provide first and second doses over the course of 3 visits to both residents and staff at those facilities. The doses that those teams will be using will be part of the doses that CDC has allocated for California. And to begin that program, we've set aside 80,000 doses of Pfizer vaccine to begin that program. Question 3, how will any group of essential workers receive notification that they qualify to receive their vaccine? And then there was a specific question about home-based home-based caregivers and about IHSS workers, and how will they be notified? And I think the answer for both parts of that question is that there are a variety of ways in which workers will be notified. And those could be from notices from health departments, from their regular provider of care, from health plans, from unions, from employers, or from community organizations, or some combination of multiple notifications. And then we're expecting through our communications plans and from others that there'll be media and public service announcements about who is eligible at any given time. The next question was, how will immunizers and employers generate, validate, receive lists of employees eligible for vaccines? How will workers verify their eligibility? And this is also likely to vary or have a variety of solutions throughout California. There will be some immunization efforts that are going on at the work site, and that is the most straightforward. for identifying employees or validating eligibility. In other settings, there may be clinic appointment systems or reservation or voucher systems that are used, including use of appointment software that's where that information is provided to prioritized employees to set up their appointments. And then there may be many settings that need to rely on the honor system and rather than more sophisticated validation. Next question. Let's see. Next question. What role will health plans play in the process of notifying essential workers? That may also have different answers in different places. Some plans may know the occupation of the specific plan members or the source of their insurance, how they've gotten their insurance. In other cases, that may not be the case, whether that's an occupational group around that or not. I think all health plans have the process of broadcasting general messages, and there may be variability in targeted messages to members depending on their occupation and their role in the economy. Another question was, can the state or employers make the vaccine mandatory in order to work? This question's been reviewed by legal staff at CDC, and in which case that under the emergency use authorization, there cannot be a federal mandate for any vaccine under the emergency use authorization, but there's not a prohibition for a state or local or private mandate for that. So that's in terms of the legal aspect of that question, it would appear to be possible, but CDPH has not taken a position at this point on mandates per se, or the advisability of making such a mandate. So I think we can go on to the next slide. I'm happy to try and answer follow-up questions throughout the hour.
I think we'll go through phase 1B first to make sure we get through this next important discussion, and then we'll have questions, if that's okay.
Sure, absolutely.
Thanks, Bobby. That's right. I know that folks are going to have questions about phase 1B, so we want to make sure to have time for that. And to introduce that discussion, I'd like to introduce Dr. Oliver Brooks, our co-chair of our drafting guidelines work group, along with Dr. Ron Chapman from CDPH. And I want to remind members that about our previous conversation and discussion about equity, all of the themes from our previous meetings were given to the drafting guidelines work group before they met last Friday. And so all of the information from our December 9th meeting, where we had a robust conversation about equity, was shared. And they reviewed them in writing and discussed these important issues, and particularly the issue that was raised about intersectionality and the intersectionality of criteria that members of this committee raised at the last meeting. Today, we've asked the drafting guidelines work group to bring to us their most informed guidance on the essential workers phase 1B tier for our discussion. A number of members of the drafting guidelines work group have been attending our meetings to also hear firsthand your feedback. And I want to remind people that we're talking about sectors, right, outlined by Governor Newsom in March of 2020, and then updated in early December, not individual occupations at this point. And members were sent a listing of these sectors, which you all should have received. And so now I want to turn it over to Oliver and our drafting guidelines work group to share with us their recommendations.
All right, thank you very much, Surgeon General Burke Harris. So go to the next slide, please. So importantly, as we discuss this information now that we look to prioritize phase 1B after healthcare workers and residents of nursing homes and assisted living facilities, just be clear again, we're talking about sectors as delineated by the governor and updated in December. You may remember some number around 8.2 million. So the updated information of total workers classified as essential workers is 11.9 million. And when you parse out, that's 2/3 of California's total workforce. So we're 2/3 of us are essential. That's nice to know. One other comment I'm going to make, just going backward a little bit, we've discussed an update from the public comments. We've had an update of the science work on the Pfizer vaccine. We've had that major discussion bringing out Vaccinate ALL 58 on messaging. I want to say this is something we introduced early on and that I will still say is in play is this. Surgeon General mentioned foundational principles for messaging, acknowledgement, engagement, and action. But I will also say, and I believe she'll agree, and this came out in the chat box, we are also looking at transparency, safety, and equity. So those foundational principles are still undergirding basically everything we're discussing. So when you all were talking about those issues under messaging about, how do we work certain groups in? Well, equity, which is probably the most salient one, but there's a lot of discussion about transparency. So that is there also. But looking now at this slide, we have to figure who we're going to prioritize in phase 1B. So this just gives you who is in there in terms of numbers. You see by far agricultural and food workers are the most numerous. But we will need to look through that and make a determination of exactly how that gets broken down. So again, there are 13 sectors. And if you think about the occupations under those sectors, that information was actually sent out at an earlier time. So if you're looking at one particular group, think of where they would fit under these sectors, because that's how we're going to make our determination. Next slide, please. And as it relates to making, thank you. As it relates to making these decisions in terms of prioritization or sub-prioritization, these are the criteria that we're really looking at. And this was suggested by you all. And it was taken back to the drafting guidelines work group. And it was discussed, and it made perfect sense to us also. So as you see, societal impact of the job, and we have those 6 bullets, but that's including but not limited to those 6 bullets. Going to the right, equity, and giving some examples, including but not limited to those 4. Impact on economy, and then again, some examples, and occupational exposure. So when you look at those 4 areas, that's what we're going to look at. That's what we're going to evaluate to determine how we rank them. That's what the drafting guidelines group did. And we put an asterisk by the fact that you all made the specific point that there's intersectionality. So someone that may have societal impact may also be high on the equity index and be exposed. So they matched 3 out of 4. So we clearly understood that when we were doing our deliberations, and we thank you for pointing it out to us, and equity went through everything. So I'm going to turn it back over to Rob or Ron for slide 20. That'll be Rob Schechter. And then we'll come back to all of this.
Thank you, Dr. Brooks.
Thanks, Rob.
So in our deliberations in the work group's deliberations on essential workers in these sectors, looking carefully at the criteria that that the work group, that the advisory committee had proposed, and the discussion of those detailed points. We reviewed carefully those criteria against the different sectors. We also received some presentation, some data on economic analysis and on medical risk of occupational exposure and medical risk in different groups. And then applied these key criteria of occupational exposure, of equity, of societal impact, and of economic impact against these sectors, these 16 sectors. Next slide, please. And in that discussion, the three sectors which there was the greatest support for, that rose to the top of these sectors, were three. These are listed in alphabetical order rather than any priority order, and they're not further ranked between them. But the three sectors of education and childcare, of emergency services, and of food and agriculture were consensus from the group as being within the top candidates for tier 1 within phase 1B. And we have some partial occupational categories within these sectors on the next slides about what they who's counted within them. So within that's fine. The next slide would be fine. Thank you. So within the sector of education and childcare, including childcare, preschool, elementary and secondary school, community college, post-secondary, and trade school, a variety, and then in these next two sectors as well, a large number of categories of potential occupations within the sector. Primarily in the discussion, again, as Dr. Brooks said, we were discussing these as sectors, but they do include these occupational categories. Next slide, please. Emergency services, the formal occupations in the sector include first responders. The medical first responders included in being included in 1A, but this including the non-medical first responders, law enforcement, firefighters, child youth services, shelters, non-residential social services, justice and safety activities. Next slide, please. And then a broad number of occupations included within food and agriculture, including agricultural workers, grocery stores, food markets, pharmacy, drugstores, a variety of food and ag related occupations. Next slide, please. In thinking about these and the other sectors, the group has also reviewed potential criteria that if doses are scarce, those total between the three of them totaled around 5 to 6 million doses of vaccine if everybody were to choose to accept it. So, so the group has also been discussing possible criteria for sub-prioritization of workers within a sector when doses are scarce. Again, as with the prior list, these are not currently ranked or prioritized. These are lists for consideration to bring into this discussion today and into the work group's next discussion. So some of these criteria for sub-prioritization and just, I guess, another, before describing them, just to say that these are also criteria that were on the earlier larger list, primarily under occupational exposure, as practical and meaningful ways to potentially sub-prioritize between workers, including risk of severe disease or death, whether related to age or underlying medical conditions, necessity of occupational exposure, inability to work at home, the economic necessity of the sector, the occupation of the work for the workers, the economic necessity for the workers, residents or work in disadvantaged communities that have been hardest hit by the pandemic, and the implications for spreading disease to workers in the public. As mentioned in prior meetings, this is and as Dr. Sawyer mentioned earlier in the meeting today, this is a concern that we'll have more information about over the course of the next months about the ability of the vaccines to limit spread. So to recap, in considering who should be prioritized first within 1B, we've discussed the drafting group has discussed 3 sectors that could be included that have risen to the top and seeking your reactions and comments today on these 3 sectors, and then possible criteria for sub-prioritization. Next slide, please. Another consideration for all of us is, once these workers are prioritized, how can they best be reached, and what tools do we have to make sure they're getting the message, and to know that they're prioritized, to encourage them to come in and to deliver services to them. This is a combination in all aspects of the campaign, including outreach, education, and counseling, and providing access to the vaccine in an expanding mix of locations, including whether it's designated clinics that public health or others are organizing, whether it's at routine sites of care where these workers are getting their routine or special care, and special efforts to in the workplace to have worksite-based immunization at or adjacent to the workplace. Whichever aspect we're talking about, the partnerships and your support, support of community-based organizations, your organizations will be crucial as the themes of the discussion today and in our past meetings. And next slide, please. So before opening up the discussion, just want to mention a few other steps in process. So again, over the last days, this meeting on Sunday with the Federal Advisory Committee of Immunization Practices has been set up to specifically discuss additional prioritization through phase 1 and phase 1B and phase 1C. And so why the advisory group and the drafting work group are independent of the ACIP, we'll be following this closely to see, to note the discussion of the experts and the experts and the public comment that come out through the discussion, the national discussion on Sunday. Next slide, please. So looking ahead, the drafting work group will be taking in the discussion today and the input over the past few hours and to this session as well. And then we'll be taking into account not only this discussion today, but ACIP deliberations and recommendations, and thinking about how sub-prioritization criteria in reaction to how detailed or general the ACIP recommendations are, and what sub-prioritization criteria will be practical and useful and support the principles for California. Next slide, please. So I will pass it back to Dr. Brooks to kick off discussion with the advisory committee, and appreciate your attention.
All right. Thanks very much, Rob. So to you all, that was an excellent presentation from Dr. Scheck in terms of the deliberations of the drafting guidelines work group. Of significance was that there's more coming in. The ACIP is going to make recommendations. You all are going to make recommendations now, and then we may need to sub-prioritize. There are 5.9 million workers that we're talking about in Tier 1. And do note that that excludes healthcare providers. So they're considered essential workers, but obviously they've already been spoken for. So before we get to discussion and your comments, I'm going to turn it back over to the Surgeon General for some comments.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Schechter and Dr. Brooks, for your work and the work of the Drafting Guidelines Committee, and really want to open it up for this conversation because we really want to hear from you all as to your thoughts and feedback and input.
Great. Well, so I just want to remind everybody as we have this discussion that if you think back to Rob's slide earlier in right after the break, that we'd have 2 million doses of the vaccine by the end of December, and potentially by the end of January, 4 million doses. And we have the healthcare workers and the residents of the long-term care facilities, and now we have these essential workers. So I want to start by calling on Lisa, and then Charles, and then Michael Fay, and then Diana, and then Anthony, and then Mitch. And then we'll see where we are. And I see Matt and Ronnie also, and Danny have their hands up. So let's get started here. Lisa, and make sure to introduce yourselves.
I'm Lisa Coleman. I'm the Executive Director for CALCOA, the California Long-Term Care Ombudsman Association. So the ombudsmans are the advocates that are going into the skilled nursing facilities as well as the assisted living facilities. And it's the assisted living facilities that I'm getting the most questions and concerns from the local ombudsman programs. There's a lot of information that's talking about the skilled nursing facilities. But it's when is this pharmacy program being activated for the assisted living facilities? And will they be doing the in-person 3 events in 6-bed facilities, or is that just in the larger facilities? Will the 6-bed facilities be expected to be getting it from their medical provider? It's this lack of transparency at the county level with local public health that's really being frustrating for the ombudsman programs, because families are calling us. And an ombudsman is not about advocating whether you do get the vaccine or you don't get the vaccine. They're just about advocating, do you have the information that you need to make that decision? And if we don't even know, are the assisted living facilities getting it at the same time as the local nursing home? That's where my memberships are really frustrated and worried. So
Lisa, I'm going to ask Rob if he might just give a little more information on that, because I know a lot of people have that question.
Thank you, Bobby, and thank you for your question, Lisa. So the pharmacy partnership is structured in a Part A, which is the skilled nursing facilities, and the Part B, which is assisted living and related facilities. The state is looking very closely at the activation of the Part B, which would permit in the next weeks, again with a few week lag time, that start of immunization in the facilities that you represent and that you're asking about. So I think there'll be a decision and closure and more information shortly for you and your constituents, and for you and the members, and for the families that are concerned about their family members in those settings. And certainly with the surge of disease, we're concerned about reaching out to them too. It's a large number of facilities and a large number of doses, and want to get them to those members shortly.
And quick comment, I'm going to ask that everyone, and thank you, Lisa, everyone keep your comments as brief as you can, because there's a lot of people that want to comment. We don't have a lot of time. And then it also sounds like, Lisa, it's not lack of transparency, it's just like, we're really just working this out. So I don't believe anyone's like keeping something from you. That's my presumption. So Bobby, can you go
Yeah,
back?
thanks. No, thanks, Oliver. I was going to say the same thing. If everybody could be as succinct as possible, because we do have a lot of people. And if your question or comment gets raised, perhaps you can step out of line. Okay, we'll go to Charles and then Michael.
Very helpful. I just wanted to emphasize.
Charles, why don't you introduce yourself?
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Bobby. Charles Bakke with the California Association of Health Plans. Again, all the comments I just previously said repeated. I'm trying to keep it brief. But I just wanted to emphasize that as we go into this sort of next phase of doing essential workers, and I think that the presentation implied this, there isn't a total solution to identifying these workers and getting them into a facility to be vaccinated. As plans, we have limited data. You can have one person who is the policy holder, but they're not an essential worker, but a member of the family is. And so, we can't sort this all out. And I think that there's also challenges for the providers to sort out who is and who isn't in the right prioritization. So I just wanted to flag for you guys as you're working through this, that I appreciate your sensitivity to the fact that you've got to have a community level approach to getting essential workers in to be vaccinated. Because unfortunately, and I think this is a real challenge for the state, there isn't like an easy way to do it other than having employers self-certify that their workers are essential. Even in the transportation industry, for example, you've got people who drive trucks, you've got people in a warehouse, and so I guess we have to be careful about trying to be too perfect in what it is we're doing, and look at ways to say, hey, look, it's not perfect, but let's try to get as many people in to get as vaccinated in the right order as possible. Because I think for us as plans and for our provider partners, we don't want to be sorting through and telling people no and telling people yes at the site of the vaccination. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. Michael, and then we'll go to Diana.
Good evening, Michael Fye. I'm with the California Professional Firefighters. Again, thank you for adding us to the conversation. It's been great to be part of this. I'm glad we could give our 2 cents. And my question is really quick. I was hoping that you could provide some clarification, because quite a few of my members have been confused as you've placed firefighters in 1B, as well as EMTs and paramedics are in 1A. And pretty much every one of our members for the California Professional Firefighters is either a paramedic or an EMT. So I was hoping you could provide some clarification as to how that could have happened. Thank you.
Great question. Rob, do you want to jump in there?
Thanks for the question. It would be based on the role that your members and colleagues play, and to what degree they're providing health services, and certainly appreciate that a large proportion of them do.
Okay, hope that helped, Michael. Let's go on to Diana and then Anthony.
Diana Tellefson Torres with the UFW Foundation. Definitely appreciate having agricultural workers included in the 3 categories that were just described as potential priorities, and especially because of the high level of exposure and vulnerability. Wanted to get some clarification as you all were discussing sub-prioritization. Are you saying that within each of the categories, for instance, for food and ag industry, that you are still going to determine who within that category would be a priority in 1B?
Rob, do you want to explain, or Dr. Brooks, how the sub-prioritization list interacts with the sector?
I'm gonna let Rob answer that, please.
So similar to what we described for the healthcare workers, as whether in the outreach or at the point of care, the point of offering immunization, that we'll be grappling with trying to determine criteria that can be used practically and efficiently to sort between worthy recipients of scarce vaccine. So whether that's an age, using age or medical conditions, or other factors to be able to give providers and the public and the workers clarity as to come in first, and then you'll be shortly next, based on these criteria. What makes sense in a whether it's a community health center provider or a mass public clinic. What are some practical tools that can be used to be able to let the highest risk or those at priority go first?
And if I make a quick comment for healthcare workers, for example, age was one, degree occupational exposure was two, and then our third was like other, which could be everything, including equity and societal impact. So that's kind of how it would work. But right now, just for personal discussions tonight, do note that we, at the end of at 6 o'clock, we would like to know that it's going to be these three sectors, and then those details will follow. Bobby?
And Dr. Brooks, can you, just as far as timing, will that decision be made prior to us meeting next? Just because I would hope that agricultural workers would stay in its entirety in the 1B section, just because of the very, very high level of vulnerability. And in addition, this is also through word of mouth. Many workers are isolated. And so if someone is actually willing to go get vaccinated, it behooves us to do that in such a vulnerable population.
Well, Deanna,
just wanted
we're at the end of the night today. It would be food, agriculture, educational, childcare, and emergency management, emergency services, period. Bobby?
Thanks, Diana, for the clarification. Let's go on, Anthony, and then Mitch.
Yeah, these, just to try to be quick and not to repeat things that I said in the chat. I think that these categories make sense for prioritization. Emergency services, I would have a broader definition to include nonprofit social services, food and ag, and education, especially if that means that we can get to save some part of our kids' school year in person, and that depends on the timing of this. And so I think my concern is very much about how this interacts with the timing and with the logistics of this. I have to say, what I'm really concerned about is this period of time between this moment now with where we have like a very focused amount of attention to healthcare workers and long-term care facilities, and then the moment of surplus. But this time in between where we have a lot but not enough, I think concerns me greatly, because of the lack of clarity that the public will have about who applies when. And if we get too complex, I think there will be a lot of distrust of the process. There will be people who will be seeing, oh, the boss of somebody is getting the vial for themselves and not for somebody who might be more worthy than me. And then there's a social solidarity here that we all say, yes, the healthcare workers go first. But once people think that other people are sort of cutting the line, that dissolves the social compact that we're all in. And I'm really scared about that. And so the question is, how do we try to create some simplicity and some clarity? And so I'm really scared when the answer last week was the counties are making their own decisions. This is all going to be on a case by case in different ways in different areas. That raises real concern for me, because it only takes a couple of bad stories in the media to be spread around the entire internet, even if it's done in only one county. So sorry. So let me just say very quickly then, And I think that that just raises equity in like 5 different ways, like, because we all know that like who will have the, you know, if the rumor that I heard that the people who were the head of the shipping companies could get vials for themselves, like, you know, I just don't imagine if we're doing that through X number of employers. So the thing I'm just wondering is, I do think that these three stages are important, but I don't know if it, like either with it or right after it, we have other types of approaches than sort of an industry or occupation, which are just such big categories. I don't know if we can do it right. And so I don't know if it's age-based, like some other countries do, like anybody over X age gets it, which would really help with ICU capacity, or if it's place-based, whether it's based on ICU capacity or the Healthy Places Index, or something that really is infused with the real capacity and equity issues we have. So I'll stop there, but that's my point.
All right, thanks, Anthony. I'll just say that right now, at the end of the day, it will be the 3 sectors, and then as we move forward, we'll probably parse it out some more. And then we'll be looking at other sectors, you know, in terms of this is tier 1, and then there'll be more tiers with other essential worker sectors. Bobby?
But I guess what I'm suggesting is that we don't look at just at industry and occupation, because I do think the logistics, I'll just say, I think the logistics of doing it that way make it hard, and there might be other ways where it might be a logistical easier way, and we need to consider that as well. That's all.
Okay. Thank you. All right, Bobby, who's next?
Thanks, Anthony. Yeah, let's go to Mitch and then Melissa Stafford Jones, and then we're going to do a time check and see where we are. Mitch?
Bobby, Mitch Steiger with the California Labor Federation. Thank you so much for all the work that went into this. And Anthony said most of what I wanted to say, probably much more eloquently than I could have, but really did also want to reiterate the point that all of these principles really are going to kind of evaporate if we allow this to move forward with a relatively decentralized approach, where we give these concepts to counties and then hope they follow them, but there's really nothing they're requiring them to. And I think we already see a little bit of that in LA County, where it seems like it's out there, but there's just a lot of latitude there to do what they want. And there's not a whole lot of transparency over why they made the decisions they did. And that if we allow it to move forward like that without some real clear guidance or directive from the state to the counties and to the private sector partners that this is the way it's going to go down, then, I mean, we could really be looking down the barrel of one of the biggest disasters we've seen in this state. We really don't want that to happen. And so we really, there are no easy answers, there are no great ideas, but we really do think we should come up with the best ideas we can, and then do the best we can to really enforce those on the localities and private sector partners to make sure that these goals are met. And also just wanted to make one quick pitch for really keeping in mind what the workers administering the vaccine are going to have to go through. That they really do need to be trained in administering vaccines. We need to make sure that, you know, we don't have people doing this that, you know, aren't ready for the anaphylactic shock, that aren't ready for all that. This is a lot more complicated than most people think it is. And the workers really need the training. And we also need to figure out what we do when angry people who can't get the vaccine show up and you know, you've got a pharmacy tech who's not covered by any kind of workplace violence prevention standard, has to deal with someone, you know, screaming at them, really angry that, you know, this life-saving care isn't going to be offered to them. So we really do think that needs to be a guiding principle over all this as well.
All right.
Mitch. So let's, Melissa, let's go to you next. And then I think it would be helpful for Rob and maybe Dr. Pond to just say a few words about what the directions are to the counties. And then we'll go back to Dr. Burke-Harris to, we have a few announcements we have to make at the end of the meeting. So for those of you that won't have a chance to speak, if you could put your comments in the chat so those comments can be forwarded to the drafting guidelines work group and to the rest of the members, that would be awesome. Melissa?
Thanks, Bobby. Melissa Stafford Jones, Executive Director with the First to Five Association of California. I want to just appreciate the really challenging and thoughtful work that's been done and the emphasis on intersectionality that Dr. Burke-Harris talked about. I thought that was one of the really important parts of our last meeting and discussion, and I appreciate that the advisory group's thoughts on that were brought forward. I also want to just express support and appreciation for the 3 categories, and just note that in particular, in the inclusion of childcare workers, the inclusion of both formal and informal childcare workers is incredibly important. So really appreciate seeing that there. We actually know that many of our youngest children in particular are served by informal childcare workers. So I really appreciate seeing that and hope that continues on our planning and list. I'm wondering, actually, my question in a way builds on, I think, the last two comments, which is I was wondering, maybe not for this meeting, but for an upcoming meeting, it's sounding like maybe the group would appreciate some discussion of the how we're going to translate prioritization into sort of an action plan or a work plan that deals with the simplicity issues that Anthony's talking about and some of the challenges that Mitch was just raising. And I don't know whether that's for this whole group or maybe it's about just being briefed on the how of the state is thinking about doing that. And I realize there's complexity because it's going to have to involve partners. Like, we know that at the local level, local first fives, our key partners, know who a lot of those informal childcare providers are that might not be on a list somewhere. But like the how, maybe that's what the group is asking for, some more in-depth discussion around that so that we can have clarity and support with each other in how to move that forward. So thanks again for all the hard work.
Thank you, Melissa, for those comments. So Rob, maybe just a few words and we can cover this in more depth. We're meeting next week, in case anyone forgot. About what kind of directives are being given to the local health departments. And then Dr. Pon, perhaps you'd like to add into that.
Sure, and I know we've got some local health department representatives who are welcome to add or correct my errors. But the health departments have a tremendously challenging job of being in the middle of getting these dose allocations and implementing the guidelines that our drafting work group is coming up with in terms of directing those doses to the providers who can reach the healthcare workers in the congregate setting, the long-term care setting, residents and staff initially, and then will be charged with the providers who can reach both the providers and the special clinics, the additional clinics, community clinics, and mass clinics to support the essential workers as well. The expectation is that there, as I think may have mentioned before, that for any provider to receive vaccine, they're signing contractual language with the federal government that says they will be abiding by federal recommendations and state and federal laws. So our message is both to the local health departments and to the providers are these are the federal guidelines. These are and these are our state guidelines as well. There are a lot of challenges in doing that, both in terms of account of for instance, the occupational mix or the employment mix in a county, which the drafting guidelines work group is trying to take into account, that the proportion of agricultural workers in the Central Valley is maybe very different from a more urban county, and so how will these guidelines be applied in all of these settings, and that the practical implementation of these to get these to the providers serving the priority groups does require local knowledge, local discretion, and some degree of flexibility. So it's in order to meet these guidelines. I'll stop there and see if any of the health department representatives or health executives or anybody else would like to add practical experience to my words.
Thanks, Rob. I think Erica's going to say a few words.
Sure.
Great
Yeah.
to hear from you, Erica.
Yeah, thank you. I think just to add on, and I think actually I'll just speak briefly, both from my current state role, but actually speaking as someone who had to implement in 2009 an H1N1 in a similar scenario from a local level. As mentioned, we do have at least a couple of local health department representatives, and I think it would be useful, and some of you mentioned in one of our first meetings, you'd like to hear more about that. So I think that'd be a useful thing we can tee up for a future time. I think just like we're thinking as the state of California and getting your valuable input from what the federal guidelines are and what are the unique areas about our state. And of course, we've been talking a lot lately at the state level about we are sort of like 5 states because we have so many different kinds of, regions and counties, and the epidemiology is different. As already mentioned, the proportion of agricultural workers in one region is going to be very different than others, where local health departments are seeing actually the most morbidity and mortality and or outbreaks might really be impacting that local level implementation. So I think we are trying to do all this layering, and it is challenge, as you all said, and the devil's in the details. So I think absolutely, I think it makes sense maybe at a future meeting to have some of our local health departments actually just give you their perspective on sort of how they're thinking about this and how they'll take this layer of recommendations and take that to the next level. And I think we'll want to hear, it's really helpful to hear from you that there is a perception of not enough transparency. And I think we all want to work on that together with you because I think, again, all of us want the best for our community and for California, and to do this in the most equitable, safe, and transparent way with really challenging decisions. So again, thank you all for this really important input. I'll turn it over to Dr. Burke-Harris.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pan. And so as we are wrapping up our 4th meeting, first of all, I want to say, wow, we have covered an incredible amount during these meetings. And I want to thank our teams and Bobby Wunsch, our facilitator, in ensuring that this group is informed, has the information to be able to give really insightful input, and also that, we have really cultivated a very robust discussion. And I want to thank our teams for rapidly incorporating the input of this committee and bringing that back, reflecting that in the work of the drafting guidelines work group, and in bringing back responses to this committee. And I think it's all of this improves and makes better California's response and vaccine allocation strategy. Looking forward, I want to highlight that we had indicated and we had shared with you a number of next meetings. And in light of what we heard from Dr. Brooks and Dr. Schechter in terms of the fact that the ACIP is having an emergency meeting, they'll be meeting over the weekend. I think it was this Sunday. And we wanted to have the drafting guidelines work group have the opportunity to meet and consider the whatever recommendations come out of the ACIP this weekend. And so I will say good news, bad news. The good news is that our meeting on December 21st from 3 to 6 p.m., we're going to go ahead and cancel that meeting to allow our drafting guidelines work group to be able to have time to meet in response to this emergency ACIP meeting, but we do want to make sure that we're gathering your input. And so we're going to go ahead and schedule a meeting instead of on Monday, December 21st, to be on Wednesday, December 23rd. And we sincerely apologize for a last minute change in the schedule. We know how hard folks are working right now, especially during the holiday time, but we felt like this was very important in order to be able to incorporate those considerations. The good news of so the bad news is the reschedule, but the good news is that our plan is to make that meeting slightly shorter, 2 hours. So we'll plan for Wednesday, December 23rd from 2 to 4 p.m. And of course, you will receive more information from Bobby Wunsch, who has done such a great job of facilitating these meetings. And we are at 6 o'clock on the nose. We're so grateful for your time, your input, your candor, and your commitment to a vaccine distribution process in California that really upholds those values of safety, equity, and transparency. And we look forward to seeing all of you on Wednesday, the 23rd, hopefully from 2 to 4. Thank you so much.
All right.
Everyone, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Great leadership.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Sergio is on. Good.
The only reason I'm not